The market town of Flaxborough, as ever, unfolded in a stately rhythm that suggested both timelessness and the mild frustration of those obliged to live within it. On a damp Thursday morning in early May, the air was heavy with the scent of wet cobbles, newly baked rolls, and the faintly medicinal aroma that perpetually lingered about St. Ethelreda's convent. Inspector Purbright arrived just after 9, his overcoat buttoned against the drizzle, a careful umbrella tucked under one arm, and an expression of polite curiosity firmly in place. The town had, for some weeks, been whispering about the annual convent charity auction, which, despite its pious overtones, possessed all the subtle competitiveness of a village fête. Today, however, the routine charm of embroidered tablecloths, iced buns, and potted fuchsias was destined to be disrupted. Miss Gwendolen Tripp, one of the convent's more enthusiastic volunteers, and a woman whose enthusiasm usually exceeded her discretion, was the first to notice something amiss. She had entered the hall to set out the raffle tickets, only to find Sister Agnes, a matronly figure who habitually kept herself to the shadows, lying across a chair in an unnerving repose. Crimson, alarmingly bright, spread across her habit, yet no sound had accompanied her fall, and she appeared otherwise untouched. "Good heavens!" Miss Tripp exclaimed, and indeed there was a faint but unmistakable scandal in the room's air now. The other volunteers, mostly elderly ladies with their hair tied in resolute knots, rushed to her side, fluttering like linen curtains caught in a draught. The town's gossip, ever alert to any disruption, was already vibrating invisibly through telephone lines, letters, and the oblique nods exchanged over counters at the grocer's. Purbright observed the scene with characteristic restraint. Sister Agnes's eyes were closed, but her breathing remained steady. The crimson, he noted, was neither blood nor injury. It was a remarkably vivid rosewater stain from a bouquet of donated flowers that had toppled over in her collapse. A faint smile tugged at the inspector's lips. The accident, though spectacular in appearance, promised to be trivial in consequence. Nevertheless, Flaxborough responded with appropriate alarm. Mrs. Curdle, who ran the town's bakery and kept an exact ledger of who had sneezed where and when, announced that it was probably the work of some reckless hand, while Mr. Pritchard, the auction's chairman, and a man of considerable importance to the council, began murmuring about insurance and liability as though the fate of the nation might hang on it. Purbright allowed them to chatter, noting the subtle variations in tone. There was genuine concern in some voices, but in others barely concealed curiosity and a hint of satisfaction. Flaxborough was never quite comfortable with harmony. The occasional scandal, however minor, was welcomed like a fresh loaf of bread at the Sunday market. He approached Sister Agnes, whose eyes now fluttered open, expressing polite astonishment at the attention. "I seem to have misplaced my equilibrium," she murmured. Purbright inclined his head. "A most unfortunate event, sister. I trust the flowers are the only casualties?" "Merely a bouquet," she replied, glancing at the drenched petals scattered across the polished floor. "Though I confess, the crimson may cause some lasting anxiety among the newer novices." By the time the vicar, Reverend Miles, arrived, bearing a mild concern and a handkerchief pressed nervously to his chest, Purbright had already begun the quiet survey of the hall. The windows were fogged with condensation, the tables were slightly askew, a single raffle ticket lay beneath the organ, facing the wrong way. None of this suggested criminal intent, but it was precisely the sort of minor disorder that Flaxborough's citizens would construe into narrative drama. "Inspector," said the vicar, "you will, of course, wish to take note of everything." "Indeed," Purbright replied, inclining his head in acknowledgment, "though it seems that in Flaxborough the crime is often in the telling rather than the doing." He spent a few moments speaking quietly with Miss Tripp, and the other volunteers, asking gently about their routines, the time the flowers had been delivered, and the recent health of Sister Agnes. Their responses were a mixture of precise recollection and social embellishment, the latter revealing far more about their own anxieties than about the incident itself. By 11 o'clock, the hall had been restored to a semblance of order, and Sister Agnes, still dabbing at the remaining rosewater stain with a handkerchief, assured everyone that she was entirely unharmed. Yet the story had already begun to spread, like a delicate blush across the cobbled streets, the nun who had slept in crimson. Even at this early stage, variations of the tale were emerging. One version had Sister Agnes fainting in despair over a mislaid ledger. Another suggested she had swooned at the sight of a particularly extravagant hat at the auction. Still others whispered, with conspiratorial glee, of a scandalous lover in the back pew. Purbright allowed the whispers to swirl around him. Each story, he knew, contained a fragment of truth, a grain of misperception, and an abundance of human desire to render the ordinary extraordinary. His task, as always, would be to separate the first from the last, to detect the subtle harmonics beneath the chorus of gossip. As he left St. Ethelreda's for his midday inspection rounds, umbrella closed and coat still buttoned, he reflected on the curious charm of Flaxborough, a town so polite that even its scandals arrived in well-pressed gloves. And yet, beneath the civility, there was always, as he well knew, a faint hum of disorder waiting to be noticed. Tomorrow he thought the story would evolve, but today, at least the most remarkable event in Flaxborough was nothing more than a nun, some crimson rosewater, and the ever-delightful unpredictability of human imagination. The story of Flaxborough's unusual morning spread quickly, as stories are wont to do in a town where nothing ever truly stayed private. By mid-afternoon, the tale of Sister Agnes and her crimson mishap had transformed in the telling. At the post office, Mr. Whittle insisted to anyone within earshot that the nun had been nearly unconscious, while at the butcher's, Mrs. Farnaby insisted she had hardly breathed for the suspense upon seeing the dramatic sight. Each recitation carried its own particular flourish, a subtle testament to the town's collective imagination. Purbright, meanwhile, moved quietly among the actors of this small drama. He called at the convent once more, ostensibly to check on Sister Agnes's well-being, but with the intention of listening to how the story had been received within the walls themselves. The novice, Miss Felicity Hargrove, appeared unusually flustered, darting glances at the inspector as though the mere act of being observed might constitute some transgression. "It was just a slip, Inspector," she whispered, "nothing more." "I assure you nothing untoward, though I admit the flowers were rather dramatic." Indeed, the flowers seemed to occupy a curious place in the investigation. Delivered by a local florist, Mr. Lobb, they had been intended for decoration, but Purbright's attention was drawn to the particular arrangement, a cluster of red roses unusually deep in hue, tied with ribbon that had frayed slightly at one end. It was not evidence in the forensic sense, but he noted, as always, that human attention to small things often revealed more than any grand gesture. At the auction hall itself, a minor debate had already arisen. Mr. Pritchard, chairman of the event, insisted that the display should be left untouched until the committee met the following week. Mrs. Farnaby disagreed, suggesting immediate rearrangement, which in her mind would restore both order and moral propriety. Purbright watched the polite conflict with interest. People, he knew, often betrayed themselves most clearly when debating something as inconsequential as table decor. The inspector then took a discreet walk through the surrounding streets, noting the subtle variations in town chatter. At the coffee house, a group of ladies speculated that perhaps Sister Agnes had fainted due to overwork. At the tobacconist, the men argued whether it was a symptom of some hidden ailment, and at the railway buffet, a young clerk confided that he had overheard the vicar muttering about an incident that might involve more than mere clumsiness. Such fragments were never reliable in isolation, yet when accumulated they formed a lattice of human intention that Purbright found far more instructive than any official statement. By evening, the first obvious suspect had emerged in local speculation. A visiting relative of one of the novices, Mr. Lionel Carruthers, had been seen lingering near the flower delivery, making him an easy target for whispered suspicion. Purbright, however, made no indication that he considered the gentleman particularly culpable. It was, in the inspector's experience, often the neatly framed suspect who most perfectly concealed the real irregularity. Purbright returned home with the day, drawing to a gentle close, his mind occupied less with the dramatic interpretations of the town than with the subtle details that only attentive observation revealed. The misaligned tables, the frayed ribbon, the precise way Sister Agnes's chair had tilted, all these seemed to hum softly in his thoughts. He allowed himself the faintest smile. In Flaxborough, the truth was rarely a sudden revelation. It was a quiet accumulation of human quirks and misplaced attentions. Later that evening, over a cup of weak tea and a newspaper whose headlines ignored the minor drama of St. Ethelreda's, Purbright considered the wider patterns. Every citizen seemed to be performing a delicate balancing act between propriety and curiosity, a choreography in which even the slightest slip, like a crimson stain, might hint at the unexpected, and he, with his habitual patience, would wait until the performance concluded before making his polite, deliberate interventions. The town would sleep that night with murmurs of scandal, each whisper slightly altered from the last, while the inspector reviewed the day's events with the quiet satisfaction of one who sees without revealing. For tomorrow promised further developments, and in Flaxborough there was always something just beneath the surface, waiting for careful eyes to notice. The following morning, Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Ethelreda's with the quiet determination of a man accustomed to observing without haste. The convent, already in a state of minor flurry from the previous day's events, seemed to regard him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Sister Agnes was, according to Miss Tripp, fully recovered, though still inclined to dramatics, and Purbright allowed a faint, amused smile to pass unnoticed. He began his inquiries with the convent staff, speaking first to Sister Agnes herself. She was impeccably composed, if a little theatrical, and recounted the events with the precision of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "I merely lost my footing," she said, her voice steady, "and the roses, well, they took the opportunity to scatter themselves." Purbright nodded politely, noting the almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers as she smoothed the hem of her habit. Such minor gestures, he reflected, often carried far more information than any spoken words. Next he spoke with Miss Felicity Hargrove, the novice who had appeared flustered the previous day. She fidgeted slightly as she recounted her version, careful to maintain decorum. "I arranged the flowers," she said. "I ensured everything was proper. I didn't see her fall until the very last moment." Purbright allowed her to continue without interruption, making a few unobtrusive notes about timing and sequence. The novice's attention to small, inconsequential details was, as he suspected, more revealing than she realized. From there, the inspector moved to the lay volunteers, a charmingly quarrelsome group who were eager to share their observations. Miss Tripp, for example, was certain that the bouquet had been cursed with misfortune, while Mrs. Farnaby argued that Sister Agnes had merely succumbed to the excitement of the auction. Purbright listened, absorbing inconsistencies in their accounts, noticing when facts were exaggerated or glossed over, and mentally cataloguing the points that might later coalesce into clarity. A brief detour to Mr. Lobb, the florist, provided yet another layer. His delivery had been punctual, his arrangement carefully balanced, and yet he admitted with a slight frown that the ribbon had been frayed, though nothing untoward, just a minor oversight in handling. Purbright made a quiet note of the ribbon and its significance, recognizing that in Flaxborough, minor oversights often precipitated major misunderstandings. By midday, he had collected impressions from nearly every relevant party: the sisters, the novices, the volunteers, and the occasional town councillor who had taken an interest. Patterns began to emerge, not from any single statement, but from the subtle overlaps and contradictions among them. Sister Agnes's careful insistence on propriety, Miss Hargrove's nervous attention to sequence, and the volunteers' dramatic flourishes all hinted at human motivations that were both simple and surprisingly complex. Even the vicar, Reverend Miles, was not exempt from scrutiny. He appeared courteous, as always, but Purbright noted the faint tension in his smile when discussing the incident, and the careful way he referred to responsibility and propriety. Nothing concrete, nothing overt, yet the combination of civility and subtle unease was instructive. By late afternoon, Purbright had assembled a quiet map of relationships, habits, and potential grievances. It was clear, he observed, that the accident, or incident, as some already preferred to call it, was less about malice than about a confluence of small human tendencies, the desire to perform, the instinct to embellish, and the persistent polite curiosity that defined Flaxborough life. He concluded his initial inquiries with a short visit to Mr. Pritchard, the auction chairman. The man was keen to frame the event as an unfortunate mishap rather than a scandal. Yet even in his careful phrasing, Purbright detected subtle defensiveness. The inspector made no immediate judgment. He never did. Observing the way people behaved under gentle scrutiny, letting them reveal themselves naturally was far more productive than forcing a confession or rushing to conclusions. As he left St. Ethelreda's that evening, the town already whispered about what might unfold next. There were speculations, of course, about motives and mishaps, and Purbright allowed them to simmer quietly. He understood that in Flaxborough the story was never a straight line, and that the resolution would require patience, observation, and a delicately timed question or remark that might unsettle the guilty or the merely embarrassed. The inspector walked the damp streets with the day's impressions settled in his mind. Every glance, every gesture, and every polite denial formed a lattice of information. He knew that the next steps would involve watching, listening, and waiting for the subtle fractures in human behaviour to appear. And he was content to do so, confident that Flaxborough always revealed its secrets in its own measured time. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into a delicate balance between curiosity and propriety, though it was clear that the town's imagination had already begun to construct its own narrative around Sister Agnes and the crimson-stained flowers. At the vicarage, Reverend Miles remarked with mild alarm that people will talk, of course, whether there is cause or not, an observation greeted with nods of polite agreement by those who had gathered for morning tea. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly thereafter, noting the subtle way gossip had begun to take shape. Certain threads were particularly persistent. Mr. Lionel Carruthers, the visiting relative of one of the novices, had been seen lingering near the flower delivery before the mishap. This detail, repeated with the inevitable embellishments, had elevated him to the position of the first obvious suspect. Townsfolk referred to him in hushed tones, describing him as peculiar or secretive, yet few could articulate exactly what behaviour merited such scrutiny. Purbright made his way to Mr. Carruthers's lodgings, a tidy set of rooms above a stationery shop in the High Street. The man greeted him with the formal courtesy characteristic of Flaxborough visitors, and, as was often the case, spoke more than was necessary. "Yes, Inspector," he said, "I was indeed near the convent earlier, but merely to observe the arrangements. I have an interest in horticulture, and one takes note of proper floral presentation." His hands were neatly clasped, his tone even, yet Purbright noticed the subtle hesitation in the description of his movements, the precise avoidance of mention about the timing of the delivery. The inspector asked a few polite, carefully phrased questions, inviting Mr. Carruthers to recount his morning step by step. The relative complied, yet in his detailed account, minor discrepancies surfaced. A glance at the clock here, a slightly different recollection of who opened the door there, each minute detail unimportant, in isolation but collectively suggestive of the natural human tendency to conceal embarrassment or inconvenience. Purbright, noting these tiny misalignments, remained outwardly courteous, making no comment beyond gentle acknowledgement. Next, he spoke to Miss Hargrove, who had interacted with Mr. Carruthers that morning. She described the exchange with careful neutrality, though she admitted she had noticed him lingering more than seemed necessary near the delivery. This statement, amplified by Miss Tripp's enthusiastic reporting, began to solidify Mr. Carruthers in the minds of the townsfolk as someone whose presence might explain the incident. Meanwhile, the volunteers and committee members debated quietly among themselves. Mrs. Farnaby suggested, in the most neutral terms possible, that perhaps it was carelessness on his part, while Mr. Pritchard cautioned against hasty assumptions. Flaxborough, as always, teetered between conjecture and decorum. Purbright left Mr. Carruthers with a polite bow, reflecting on the curious nature of suspicion in a small town. The man's behaviour was slightly unusual, certainly, but nowhere near sufficient to constitute malice. The inspector was well aware that the first obvious suspect often served merely as a convenient repository for communal anxiety, a figure upon whom gossip might safely alight without disrupting the social equilibrium too severely. Back at the convent, Sister Agnes and her fellow sisters went about their duties with renewed energy, as if conscious that their minor drama had granted them, at least temporarily, a measure of quiet authority in the town's ongoing conversation. Purbright, observing their routines, made note of patterns of behaviour, habitual movements, and social interactions. In Flaxborough, he knew, the truth rarely emerged from dramatic gestures. It was found in the habitual, the ordinary, and the slightly offbeat. As afternoon waned, a trivial but odd detail caught his attention. The frayed ribbon from the bouquet, noted yesterday, had been moved, not significantly, merely a slight adjustment, but sufficiently out of place to suggest that someone had handled it after the incident, perhaps absent-mindedly, perhaps deliberately. Purbright filed this observation away, aware that minor details often served as the first hints of a deeper pattern, even when the town's eyes were fixed on the more conspicuous suspect. Flaxborough, meanwhile, continued its polite fascination with Mr. Carruthers. Each inn, shop, and household contributed subtle embellishments. He lingered, he looked mysterious, he seemed to regard the flowers with undue interest. None of these accounts contained direct evidence, yet the town treated them as if they were sufficient. Purbright, as always, waited, knowing that patience and observation were the twin engines of understanding. By evening he returned to his office with the day's impressions carefully organized in his mind. The first obvious suspect had been identified by the town, yet the inspector made no declaration. He knew that human attention to minor drama often obscured the true story, and that a carefully measured inquiry, delicate, unobtrusive, and politely persistent, would yield far more than a rush to judgment. Tomorrow, he anticipated, would provide the opportunity to expand the field of observation, introducing other characters and details that would challenge the neat narrative the town had begun to construct. The morning air carried a crispness that suggested both promise and the gentle stirrings of concern. Inspector Purbright, making his habitual early rounds, paused before the convent gates, noting the unusually attentive glances of the novices as they arranged the flower beds. Even in small matters, he reflected, human beings revealed tendencies and preferences, and Flaxborough's citizens, though outwardly polite, rarely concealed their interest in the minor dramas of life. His attention, however, was caught by a single detail that had, until now, gone unnoticed: the frayed ribbon from the crimson bouquet. Yesterday it had lain unremarked near the chair where Sister Agnes had collapsed. Today it had shifted slightly, as if someone had handled it after the incident, leaving a faint crease and a smudge of dust on its surface. Purbright observed the pattern of its displacement with quiet scrutiny, recognizing that even the smallest irregularity could carry meaning. He inquired delicately among the novices and volunteers, asking who had touched the flowers after the incident. The responses were, as expected, inconsistent. Miss Hargrove claimed to have merely straightened the tablecloths, while Miss Tripp admitted to adjusting the bouquet for better display. Mrs. Farnaby insisted that she had only glanced at it from across the hall. Each statement, though seemingly trivial, contained subtle contradictions and variations in timing, tone, and body language. Purbright filed each observation carefully, the mental map of events growing increasingly intricate. Later, he called upon Mr. Lobb, the florist, to inspect the ribbon. The man peered closely, adjusting his spectacles. "Ah," he said, "this is no accident. The fray is consistent with handling after the delivery. Whoever touched it did so with a certain lack of care, yet also hesitation." They paused, perhaps uncertain what they ought to do. His words, precise and understated, intrigued Purbright, a minor detail certainly, but one that suggested deliberation rather than accident. As he left the florist's shop, Purbright noted other subtle indications of human behaviour: the faint scent of rosewater still clinging to the hall, a small smudge of mud on the base of a chair, the way certain villagers lingered near the convent, ostensibly to admire the flowers, but in reality to observe one another's reactions. All were minor, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they suggested a lattice of intentions, fears and ambitions underlying the town's placid surface. By afternoon, the inspector had expanded his inquiries. He spoke with Mr. Carruthers once more, now with a more pointed, though still polite, line of questioning. "Were you alone in the hall at any point after the flowers were set?" Purbright asked, his tone casual, yet deliberate. Mr. Carruthers hesitated slightly, a pause just long enough to draw attention. "I believe I was," he replied, carefully chosen words masking the subtle tension beneath. Purbright noted this with quiet satisfaction. The first obvious suspect, while convenient for gossip, might not account for the full pattern of minor irregularities he had observed. Next, he turned his attention to the volunteers. Miss Tripp, always eager to contribute, mentioned that she had overheard a whispered exchange between Sister Agnes and one of the newer novices, the conversation truncated and cryptic. "Something about the arrangement needing attention," she recalled, her tone tinged with scandalized delight. Purbright filed this away, recognizing the significance of overheard remarks. Often they revealed human anxieties that the speaker would not otherwise admit. By evening the pattern was emerging. The frayed ribbon, the subtle smudges, the hesitations and inconsistencies in accounts, all pointed toward more than mere accident. Yet the town, blissfully unaware of the intricate dance of observation, remained firmly focused on Mr. Carruthers. He had become, in popular imagination, the figurehead of blame, though Purbright suspected that the true narrative involved a broader cast and subtler motivations. As he returned to his office, umbrella dripping gently on the worn cobbles, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Flaxborough, he reflected, possessed a peculiar rhythm. The public drama rarely coincided with private truth, and only patient, meticulous observation revealed the human undercurrents beneath the polite surface. Tomorrow, he anticipated, would bring further developments, perhaps a new incident or revelation that would shift the narrative yet again. Until then, he would watch, listen, and note, confident that the town would, in its own time, provide the clues necessary for understanding. By midweek, the story of the nun in crimson had permeated nearly every corner of Flaxborough. In the bakery, at the grocer's, and even at the railway buffet, townsfolk exchanged their own interpretations, each slightly more elaborate than the last. While Mr. Carruthers remained the focal point of suspicion, Inspector Purbright understood that the unfolding mystery was far more intricate than a single, convenient target. The human web, after all, was rarely neat. Purbright began his day with a quiet walk through the market square, noting the subtle ways the townsfolk reacted to his presence. Mrs. Farnaby adjusted her apron with a touch more precision. Mr. Pritchard nodded politely, but avoided direct eye contact. Such minor gestures spoke volumes in a town where civility often masked unspoken anxieties. Returning to St. Ethelreda's, Purbright extended his inquiries beyond the convent staff. He spoke with Sister Beatrice, a figure of serene composure whose primary role appeared to be observing without comment. "I noticed," she said softly, "that some of the flowers were placed with unusual attention to symmetry. It seemed deliberate." Her remark, casual in tone, intrigued Purbright. The arrangement of flowers, he noted, was a reflection not only of aesthetic sense, but of intent, a small but telling detail. He then interviewed Mr. Lobb again, who revealed that a second delivery of flowers had been scheduled for the following day, though no explanation was given for the choice of deep crimson roses. "They requested something striking," he said, "but there was no indication of any particular reason." Purbright filed this away, aware that human taste often mirrored subconscious preoccupations. Other townsfolk began to emerge as figures of interest. Mrs. Dalloway, a local dressmaker, had been seen near the convent early that morning, ostensibly to deliver supplies, but with an air of quiet intent that could not go unnoticed. Mr. Hemming, a retired schoolmaster, had lingered by the gate for longer than polite curiosity required, adjusting his hat and glancing repeatedly toward the hall. Though neither exhibited overtly suspicious behavior, Purbright noted the subtle rhythms in their actions, timing, hesitation, and social positioning, all part of the quiet calculus of human motives. By afternoon, he convened a brief, discreet discussion with Reverend Miles. The vicar expressed mild concern about the growing attention the incident was attracting. "The townsfolk have taken it upon themselves to embellish," he said, adjusting his spectacles. Purbright, noting the emphasis on embellish, allowed a polite silence to linger, a strategy that often encouraged interlocutors to reveal more than intended. Meanwhile, the volunteers offered small but illuminating observations. Miss Tripp had noticed that certain novices were unusually keen to demonstrate their knowledge of flower arrangement, while Miss Hargrove had hesitated when asked if she had moved the ribbon herself. Each seemingly minor admission, gathered with care, contributed to a richer understanding of the subtle interactions shaping the day's events. By late afternoon, Purbright had expanded the field of consideration beyond Mr. Carruthers. Multiple figures now warranted careful observation, those whose presence was unexplained, whose attention to detail seemed exaggerated, or whose timing suggested an awareness of the incident beyond casual curiosity. Flaxborough, he reflected, had an almost theatrical quality. The town's residents performed daily routines with the added dimension of social narrative, and the truth lay hidden beneath layers of civility, and pretense. As the evening descended, the inspector returned to his office, mulling over the day's findings. The ribbon, the shifted flowers, the minor gestures of avoidance and attention, all suggested that the incident, though outwardly trivial, was part of a delicate lattice of motives and actions. Mr. Carruthers remained under the town's scrutiny, but Purbright understood that the true picture required patience, observation, and a careful piecing together of seemingly inconsequential details. He sat by the window, the cobbles glistening in the early twilight, considering the interplay of human habits and subtle mischief. In Flaxborough, he knew, the extraordinary always lurked just beneath the ordinary. And it would be these unnoticed movements, the quiet hesitations and gestures, that would ultimately reveal the story behind the nun who had slept in crimson. The following morning arrived with the mild inevitability characteristic of Flaxborough. Mist clung to the cobbles like a gauzy curtain, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth mingled with the lingering aroma of early baked bread. Inspector Purbright set out on his rounds with deliberate calm, aware that the town, in its polite vigilance, would soon supply another ripple of incident to unsettle its otherwise placid rhythm. By mid-morning, a new disturbance had occurred. One of the convent's display cabinets, containing small artifacts and framed certificates, had been found slightly ajar, its contents shifted. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, yet the subtle disorder was sufficient to attract immediate attention. Sister Agnes, who had yesterday been the central figure of crimsoned notoriety, appeared mildly distressed. "It seems," she said with measured calm, "that even the most minor arrangements may provoke unexpected complications." Purbright surveyed the cabinet carefully, noting the uneven alignment of the papers, the slight tilt of a framed certificate, and a faint smudge on the varnished surface. Each was trivial in isolation, yet, like the frayed ribbon, it suggested that someone had interfered with the display, whether through carelessness, curiosity, or subtle intent. The volunteers and novices were quick to contribute their observations. Miss Hargrove insisted she had not approached the cabinet since morning prayers, while Miss Tripp offered a hesitant account of passing by, glancing to ensure the certificates remained undisturbed. Purbright listened, noting the timing of each statement, the manner of delivery, and the slight variations in phrasing that hinted at unspoken truths. Word of the second incident travelled rapidly through Flaxborough. At the bakery, Mrs. Farnaby suggested in mild alarm that now it seems there may be more at stake than mere flowers. Mr. Pritchard, careful to maintain his image of authority, advised caution, while Mr. Carruthers, inevitably, was again drawn into whispered speculation, his presence near the convent, coinciding with both the previous and current disturbances. Yet Purbright's attention was not fixed solely on Mr. Carruthers. The cabinet's minor disorder, he reflected, might implicate someone else entirely, perhaps an eager novice, a volunteer seeking to adjust the display, or even a visitor with an unexplained interest in the convent's arrangements. The interplay of timing, access, and social intent had created a field of potential actors far wider than the town's gossip acknowledged. He returned to St. Ethelreda's, walking slowly through the cloistered gardens, observing the habitual movements of the sisters. Sister Beatrice, serene and unobtrusive, passed a glance in his direction, as if to say that she had noticed the subtle misalignments, but preferred to maintain her composure. Such quiet observation, Purbright knew, was often more telling than words. Human nature rarely permits restraint when intentions or mistakes are hidden. By afternoon he had interviewed several additional figures. A visiting town councillor who had expressed concern about insurance coverage, the convent gardener who had adjusted flower beds with particular care, and a minor shopkeeper who had been asked to deliver supplementary decorations. Each offered minor inconsistencies or ambiguous details, a slightly misremembered time, a hand brushed over a ribbon, a glance lingering too long on the display. Purbright catalogued these with meticulous care. The second incident, trivial as it appeared, had subtly shifted the landscape of suspicion. Mr. Carruthers, while still under observation, was no longer the sole figure of interest. The lattice of potential involvement had expanded, encompassing multiple participants and suggesting that motives were not necessarily malicious, but rather rooted in habitual human behavior, pride, and attention to social proprieties. As evening fell, Purbright returned to his office. The day's developments, he reflected, underscored the delicate complexity of Flaxborough life. Small actions carried unforeseen consequences, and the interplay of observation and intention was rarely linear. The second incident, trivial though it seemed, had revealed hidden facets of character and timing that would prove essential in understanding the narrative fully. Settling into his chair, he sipped his tea and reviewed his notes. The town's gossip had shifted slightly, weaving new suspicions and highlighting fresh uncertainties. Purbright, calm and attentive, prepared for the next stage of inquiry. Careful reflection on the subtleties of human behavior, a patient anticipation of missteps, and a deliberate observation of the patterns that would, in due course, reveal the truth beneath Flaxborough's polite facades. That evening, Flaxborough seemed to settle once more into its habitual rhythm, the cobbles glistening faintly under a misted street lamp, and the air carrying the faint aroma of baked bread and damp leaves. Inspector Purbright, however, remained in his office, deliberately isolated from the swirl of gossip, absorbed in quiet contemplation. The two minor incidents, the crimsoned nun and the disrupted cabinet, had provided more than mere distraction. They had begun to reveal subtle currents beneath the town's polite surface. Purbright reviewed the sequence of events in his mind, deliberately stripping away the embellishments supplied by the townsfolk. He considered human nature, the ease with which people embellished stories, the way minor discomforts or social slips could escalate into perceived scandal, and the constant tension between decorum and curiosity. Flaxborough, he reflected, was a town remarkably consistent in its civility, yet remarkably inconsistent in the accuracy of its communal narrative. He thought of Sister Agnes, poised and composed, despite the minor disruptions, and of Miss Hargrove, nervous yet conscientious, whose hesitations hinted at the internalization of both social expectation and personal responsibility. He considered Mr. Carruthers, whose polite attention had rendered him a convenient focal point, and the volunteers, whose enthusiasm and occasional overstatement provided both amusement and minor complication. Each person's behavior, he knew, was layered, a blend of habit, propriety, self-interest, and social theatre. In the quiet of his office, Purbright examined the trivial yet telling details, the frayed ribbon, now folded neatly but with a faint crease, the slight tilt of the cabinet's contents, the subtle smudges that hinted at contact or interference. None of these were evidence in the conventional sense, yet each carried information about timing, attention, and intention. He reflected on the importance of minutiae, how the smallest gesture often revealed far more than the most dramatic action. His thoughts drifted to the social fabric of Flaxborough. He noted the way villagers observed each other, the gentle scrutiny applied to every action, the unspoken hierarchy of respectability, and the pervasive, polite curiosity that had allowed both incidents to gain such traction. In this context, the incidents were not merely accidental, they were a lens through which the town's unspoken dynamics could be observed, a window into the subtle rivalries, fears, and ambitions that defined daily life. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile at the predictable patterns of gossip. Mr. Carruthers remained a convenient target, yet the real story, he understood, involved the interplay of multiple figures: the volunteers, the novices, the vicar, and even peripheral town officials, all were participants in a delicate choreography, often unaware of how their minor gestures and statements influenced perception. He considered next steps carefully. Observation would remain paramount, as would the subtle testing of reactions. He needed to provoke neither alarm nor confession, but rather to create situations where truth might emerge naturally through human behavior. Small questions, casual remarks, staged coincidences, these would be sufficient to reveal inconsistencies, hesitation, or overcompensation. As he set aside his notes, Purbright reflected on the quiet satisfaction of detective work in Flaxborough. Unlike the sensational crimes of larger cities, here the detective's task was to navigate the interplay of civility and curiosity, to decode the human patterns beneath appearances, and to discern truth in the whisper of a hesitation or the tilt of a hand. The town had presented its clues not in loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but in nuance, timing, and understated irregularities. Night fell, and Purbright remained by the window for a time, watching mist curl around the lamps and glint on the cobbles. Flaxborough slept, outwardly serene, but the subtle tensions persisted beneath the surface, waiting for the careful eye to detect them. The inspector allowed himself to feel the quiet anticipation of the next day, when the culmination of these reflections would guide his measured interventions, and the truth, as always, would reveal itself with patient, unobtrusive precision. The following morning, Flaxborough's streets carried the subdued energy of a town accustomed to its routines, punctuated by the occasional ripple of curiosity. Inspector Purbright, with careful deliberation, planned the day's inquiries as a series of quiet tests designed to observe behavior without overtly drawing attention. The previous incidents, the crimsoned nun and the shifted cabinet, had established a lattice of minor irregularities, and now he sought to see which threads would yield under gentle, polite pressure. He began at St. Ethelreda's, where the volunteers and novices were arranging flowers in preparation for an afternoon service. Purbright's approach was unobtrusive. He offered a brief comment on the choice of blooms, asking casually whether the ribbons had been checked for flaws. The remark was designed not to accuse, but to observe. Miss Hargrove responded with meticulous attention, carefully adjusting the folds, while Miss Tripp glanced briefly at him, as though gauging his tone and intent. Even these minor reactions provided insight. The degree of nervousness, the timing of responses, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact all spoke of latent anxieties and unspoken knowledge. Later, Purbright arranged a brief meeting with Mr. Carruthers under the pretense of discussing floral arrangements. "I hear you have a keen eye for symmetry," he said lightly, observing both the words and the way they were received. Mr. Carruthers inclined his head politely, but the pause before his reply, the way his hands fidgeted with a folded handkerchief, suggested a minor discomfort not explained by innocent horticultural interest alone. The inspector filed the detail quietly, recognizing that such small hesitations often concealed far more than overt denials. At mid-morning, Purbright visited the convent hall again, requesting the presence of several of the novices and volunteers. He staged a minor demonstration, asking them to realign the cabinet contents while he observed. The exercise was neutral, yet each participant's behavior revealed subtle differences. Miss Tripp's eagerness bordered on theatrical, Miss Hargrove's precision was tinged with nervous caution, and Mrs. Farnaby, observing from the sidelines, offered intermittent, unsolicited corrections with mild indignation. Purbright noted the interplay of pride, hesitation, and attention to social norms. The inspector also employed overheard remarks as part of his test. By asking general questions about timing and sequence, he subtly encouraged participants to repeat their earlier accounts. Variations emerged, minor, almost imperceptible. yet enough to suggest that the previous incidents involved more than casual mishaps. The ribbon, for instance, was mentioned repeatedly, and each account slightly differed, revealing degrees of involvement or knowledge that could not be accounted for by simple forgetfulness. By afternoon, Purbright had drawn a quiet map of reactions. He understood which individuals were likely aware of the sequence of events and which were unconsciously attempting to conceal minor mistakes. Mr. Carruthers, while still under observation, had not acted overtly culpable, yet his subtle discomfort suggested knowledge of circumstances he had not fully disclosed. Sister Agnes and the novices likewise had exhibited minor hesitations and micro-gestures that provided insight into the incident's mechanics. Purbright concluded the day with a short reflection in his office, reviewing the patterns he had observed. The test had not provoked overt confessions, nor had it yielded dramatic revelations, but it had produced something subtler and more valuable, a hierarchy of human responses, revealing both intention and awareness. In Flaxborough, he reflected, truth rarely arrived in the form of bold statements. It emerged gradually through hesitation, gesture, and attention to minor, overlooked details. The day's observations left him quietly satisfied. He had, in his understated way, nudged the town's actors into revealing themselves without disturbance or alarm. The lattice of behaviours, now more clearly defined, would guide his final inquiries, and the subtle irregularities, the frayed ribbon, the displaced cabinet, the timing of minor gestures, would converge to expose the narrative behind the seemingly innocuous incidents. Purbright allowed himself the faintest smile, acknowledging that patience and subtlety, rather than accusation, were the keys to unravelling Flaxborough's minor but revealing dramas. The test was complete, and the next step, he knew, would be the calm, civil explanation that linked every observation into a coherent understanding. By mid-morning, the atmosphere in Flaxborough was calm, almost deceptively so, as though the town had accepted the events of the past week as a minor diversion in its otherwise orderly life. Inspector Purbright, however, had long since discerned that the quiet surface concealed the intricate network of intentions and minor transgressions that had shaped the incidents. Today, he would bring that understanding into focus, linking observation and subtle deduction with the patience for which he was known. He began with a polite call to St. Ethelreda's, arranging to meet Sister Agnes, Miss Hargrove, and Miss Tripp in the convent hall. The volunteers and Mr. Carruthers were also invited, under the pretence of reviewing flower arrangements for an upcoming event. Purbright's tone was courteous, his movements unhurried, yet every question, every remark, was measured to provoke the slight adjustments in behaviour that would confirm his suspicions. "Miss Hargrove," he began, "it seems the ribbons have been rather challenging this week. One might say they have a mind of their own." The novice blushed faintly, arranging her hands in her lap. They do require attention," she admitted. Purbright nodded as though considering a trivial point, but he noted the slight hesitation and the way her eyes shifted towards Sister Agnes. Turning to Miss Tripp, he remarked, "And you, of course, are always vigilant in maintaining the presentation. I understand the cabinet also required some minor adjustments yesterday?" Miss Tripp's eyes widened, and her hands, previously clasped, twitched slightly as if compelled to fidget. "Yes. Well, I merely wished to ensure everything remained in proper order," she said, her tone suggesting both pride and a touch of defensiveness. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, a subtle technique that encouraged unspoken admissions. Then he addressed Mr. Carruthers with quiet civility. "You observed the arrangements earlier in the week, did you not? Perhaps you noticed certain discrepancies?" The visitor inclined his head, masking uncertainty with politeness. Purbright's keen observation had already identified the micro-gestures of discomfort, the fractional delay in response, the subtle shift of weight, the faint tightening of fingers. Finally, the inspector addressed the group as a whole. "It appears," he said softly, "that yesterday's slight cabinet disturbance and the earlier incident with the crimson flowers were not accidents in the sense the town presumes, but rather the result of minor interactions, each seemingly innocuous, yet cumulatively significant." He paused, letting the statement sink in, allowing the human tendency to infer guilt or responsibility to work naturally. He then detailed the minor movements he had observed over the past week, the handling of the ribbon, the adjustments to the cabinet, the hesitations in speech and movement. Each observation, when considered in conjunction with timing and access, revealed a sequence of events that clarified responsibility without assigning malice. Miss Hargrove had straightened the flowers. Miss Tripp, in her eagerness, had handled the ribbon and, inadvertently, contributed to its fray. And Mr. Carruthers, through polite attention and minor interventions, had been observed in moments of coincidental proximity that had aroused the town's suspicion. Sister Agnes, having listened with characteristic composure, finally nodded. "So," she said, "it was all in the end a matter of careful attention, human curiosity, and the small errors of habit?" Purbright inclined his head. "Precisely," he replied. "No malice, merely a combination of natural human tendencies, modest pride, and the curiosity that makes Flaxborough both charming and occasionally dramatic." The group received the explanation with a mixture of relief and quiet amusement. Even Mr. Carruthers allowed himself a faint smile, acknowledging that the perception of guilt had been both misdirected and unnecessary. Flaxborough, in its gentle way, would absorb the truth into the tapestry of daily life, where minor errors and human foibles often became stories far more compelling than reality warranted. As Purbright departed, the town continued its polite rhythms, the incidents of the past week settling into anecdote and memory. The volunteers, the novices, and even Mr. Carruthers resumed their roles with only slight adjustments in behavior, a subtle awareness that minor attention to detail had caused an unintended stir. The inspector returned to his office, satisfied that observation, patience, and polite questioning had illuminated the truth with the quiet effectiveness for which he was known. Flaxborough, as always, returned to its ordinary life, the minor drama absorbed into the gentle undercurrent of town memory. With the truth quietly established, Flaxborough resumed its daily rhythm, as if the week's minor disturbances had been nothing more than a passing breeze. The town's cobbled streets glistened under a soft drizzle, reflecting the muted light of gas lamps and the occasional glance of early risers hurrying along with parcels or umbrellas. Yet even in its outward calm, subtle changes lingered, a faint awareness among the residents that minor attention to detail could provoke unexpected ripples. At St. Ethelreda's, the convent resumed its routines. Sister Agnes moved through the hallways with her characteristic poise, carefully inspecting the flower arrangements while allowing the novices to conduct their duties with quiet autonomy. Miss Hargrove, now more confident, handled the ribbons and blooms with meticulous care, while Miss Tripp maintained her enthusiasm, tempered by a faint, polite caution. Even the volunteers, who had indulged in whispered speculations, now contributed with gentle attentiveness, mindful of the minor but observable impact of their interventions. Mr. Carruthers, relieved that the town's suspicions had been misplaced, departed shortly after the reveal, leaving Flaxborough with a slightly elevated sense of decorum. The incident had been, as Purbright predicted, absorbed into the communal narrative, occasionally retold with minor embellishments but stripped of its previous urgency. The subtle lessons of observation, patience, and human idiosyncrasy lingered quietly in the minds of those who had participated or observed. Purbright, returning to his office, reflected on the sequence of events. The frayed ribbon, the displaced cabinet, the small gestures of hesitation, all had contributed to a pattern that was neither malicious nor reckless, but deeply human. In Flaxborough, he mused, the extraordinary often emerged not from dramatic transgression, but from the careful choreography of habit, propriety, and curiosity. He spent the late afternoon reviewing his notes, filing observations of timing, speech, and gesture, each entry a testament to the subtle interplay of human behavior. The town had provided its clues willingly, yet without conscious awareness, leaving him to connect them with patience and care. He allowed himself a faint smile, appreciating the quiet satisfaction of a case resolved not by spectacle or force, but by observation and understanding. Outside, the market square bustled with familiar, orderly life. Shopkeepers attended to their counters, children scurried along with books and parcels, and the faint scent of bread and damp earth mingled in the morning air. The incidents of the past week had left only minor traces: a slightly more attentive novice, a volunteer with a cautious eye, a town councillor recalling the importance of observation, and a general awareness that even the smallest actions could ripple through the community in unforeseen ways. In his office, Purbright returned to routine paperwork, the quiet rustle of paper and the measured scratching of his pen filling the space. The town's minor drama had concluded, yet the lessons endured, embedded in the understated rhythms of daily life. Observation, patience, and courteous attention had once again revealed the truth, leaving Flaxborough untroubled, orderly, and subtly wiser. The week's events, now fully reconciled, would be remembered not for scandal or malice, but for the gentle unfolding of human behavior, the intricate, quiet theatre that played out beneath the town's surface, ever waiting for the discerning eye to notice.